Hi everyone, so in today's video we'll be building this React search component. It also uses Redux as a state management and also TypeScript for the typing. As you can see on the screen, we have different types of filters. There's categories, which is also multi-select and filters the data below it. So for this one, what I did is that I already have like boilerplate code set up for you, so you don't have to spend too much time on it. This is where the styles are. In the source we have actions, where the Redux actions are. Then we have store in the app, components for UI components, containers also for the UI. I have the data here which I generated. I'll include the link of what website I used to generate the data. Also definition, same for Redux and reducers. So this is all set up. You can check out my repo. I'm gonna include the link in the description for the GitHub. And we can get started by building the search component. So I'm gonna name it search bar. Moving this out. So first things first, import React. Also import input base. So for this one I'm using the material UI library, so importing that out. Divider also to have the division between the search input and the rest of the filters. This is just an icon for the material UI as well, so that we can press search. Here we have a search icon. And lastly, just the button from material as well. The paper, I use paper to wrap the components in the container. So importing that as well, and doing export default before I forget. And let's name this customized input base. For now, we're not gonna have any arguments, and then let's return paper. And inside in here we pass what kind of component it is. In our case it's a search, it includes input, so it would be form. Here also adding the input base. This is for the sizing, so margin left just one, flex would be one as well, we want it to be flex element. Setting placeholder search. Also passing the input props, area label for the accessibility purposes. This since is a search. And lastly, like the button to clear what user has typed. For now, I'm gonna leave it disabled, and then I'll update it conditionally. And we also need the search button itself. The type of this would be submit. Also adding area label. And then here is our icon. So it should not, oh, I'm missing the function, yeah. Okay, so let's go back to the index. This is our main page, and let's import the search bar here, so that we'll be able to like reload and see it on our page. So this is in components folder, and let's just remove this hello world and put it instead of that one. Okay, let's reload. Okay, so here we have our search bar. We can like type it in, and now let's go back to the search bar itself, like add some styling, because we want it to like the organization, we want the input to take most of the space. So this is add some padding, update the paper component, which is the container. Same thing here, some padding around it. display would be a flex, and then we would allocate the items accordingly, align items in the center. And let's do width 600. Also, let's set the height to fit the content. I'm gonna move this out so it's more visible. Some margin at the top so it's not very top of the page. Yeah, so this is how it looks like. Okay, so now let's go back to the index page and add some styling around search bar. So for that, I'm going to use box also from Material UI. This is mainly for like the header, like header image. Not really an image. I'm just gonna use like color for the container. So importing purple as well. Material UI has also their like color palette, so we don't have to use any like hash components or anything. So inside box, I'm gonna put in the search bar, and here we can add some styling. So display would be flex again. Justify content, we want everything vertically to be like centered. Also margin would be 1. So now setting the background color, I'm using purple here. For the border radius, just making a little bit rounded borders. Width, let's set it to 70%. For the margin, it would be auto, so it would be like centered. Height also 400 pixels. And let's see what we have. Okay, this looks beautiful. Now let's go add, so this is just for the demo purposes. For the container example, I created like an empty filters file, but let's update and add filters in here. So same thing, let's use box as our container from Material UI. And another thing, let's import button as well. So this would basically use to clear the filters. So let's remove this extra code from here, add the box. This is just to make sure that this gets displayed, and button also disabled until we have the check in place whether or not it should be disabled. Some styling, same thing, width would be 600 pixels, same as the search bar. Background color in this case is white. What else? Border color, I'm just gonna set what I have here. This is just adding like a little bit of gray. Border width would be 1 pixel. Display would also be flex. We need to use string. Justify content space between. And let's see what we have here. Let's import the filters in our index so that we are able to see them. So filters, this is from containers, not the components. Let's move them under the search bar. Okay, so here they are. The styling is not best, but at least we are sure that it's getting displayed. So let's update the flex direction of the box so that it's column. Also let's center it. Yeah. So this is the placement we want. Now creating the new file for one type of filter, which is multi-select. What this will give us opportunity to just display the list and select multiple elements. So adding export default function, name of the file, multi-select, let's say chip, and creating a div in here, div tag. So we are also going to need the form control that automatically gets imported at the top if I select it from my dropdown. Some margin and width as well. So closing off the tag. Inside we have input label. This is for when user starts typing, the options that are listed in the multi-select get updated, adding some array to it. And just name. This name would be passed down as props later on, but for now let's leave it that. We also need select, which would be the options list itself. So label ID, and multiple means that we are able to have multiple selections. So value of this one would be just the title itself. So we'll pass that later on, and let's close out the select tag for now. And let's locally store like the name of selection. So I'm gonna name it filter name. Initially I'm using useStateHook, typing here that it is string array, and initially this would be an empty array. And so the value of this one would be filter name. Adding input prop, and we're gonna make this like some styled outline input, which is also a material UI component. This input could have been like simpler, but just for the styling purposes, we're gonna use the outlined input. Now how do we want to render value? In this case, we just simply want it displayed as it is, but if you, let's say, had a complicated object and you only wanted to display like a specific field, this is where you would update that. So let's have this box display flex wrap, passing in the gap in between the elements and closing the box. And here just the name of the value, so it would be the value that matches the name. So chip key equals value, label also value, and we close this off. Red. So what I'm gonna do here before I resolve the issue is I'm gonna add like the fake array of like names that I want to display. So I'm gonna make sure I use that array to display the options here. So let's say names map name, and then we have the menu item itself. So the key always has to be unique. In this case it would be name. The value would also be name. And closing this off, and what it gets displayed is also name in here on line 37. Let's see. So in the filters, let's import this first filter that we created and display it in the filters container. So multi-select for now, it doesn't have any props, but we're gonna add them on later on. So there's an issue with the import statement. Oh, because I automatically selected import, so it has to be after material UI got updated, they use this tag and MUI. So okay, so we have our two options here. Now let's go back and add the function itself that would handle the select. So when something gets selected. So the type of this would be the filter name itself, which holds the values. And then, so just because this will take in the event, we have to describe it as select change event. So constant, let's do some destructuring, constant target value. We'll get that from the event itself because we need the value only. And then later on we can use this value that got selected to pass it on. But for now, locally, we're going to store it in our set filter name. So type of value, if it equals to string, then we say like we split the value. And if it's just like one value, we pass it directly. The reason we have to do this is because this material UI select sometimes returns multiple values together. But in order to use this function on the select, we need to use onChange props and then handle change. And then I haven't passed box at the top, so that's why this was red. Okay, so now we can see it got selected. We see the chips at the top. Now let's have update the height and some of the padding. This is just config, so it's easier at the top, it's easily configurable, and set some of the menu props. This would be paper props. This is how we pass the style. So max height, we want to define it as the item height times 4.5 or any like arbitrary number, and we add the item padding at the top. This is so that when there's multiple items selected, our component gets adjusted dynamically. And we also set the width because, as you can see, it was like the width was small. So in here, menu props, select, we pass in the props that we just declared. And let's set in the select the width to be auto. New file, let's move on to the next filter, which would be range slider. So creating file for that, import React and use state, because eventually we would need to save the range, so we need the use state. Also, I'm gonna use the slider from Material UI. And then this filter would be also, we'll use it next to our like previous filter that we have. So let's use the box, and this would be just like a range selector, basically, like you can slide ranges and select. So let's name it range slider. It's a functional component. So let's store the values in here using the use state hook. So this would be of type number, and it would be an array of number because we have two values. And then by default, I would just set this values as 20 and 37, and later on we can pass it from the parent. So let's return the box with some styling, setting the width, and inside here we have our slider element. And so this is just for a real label. We can set it to be like a slider. And values of this would be also value coming from the state that we just created. Value display, it would be how we want to display the label itself. I'll pass it on as automatic. And let's create the onChange function, handle change, and let's define the function in here. So handle change takes in the event. Let's type event to be of, obviously, like type event, but with the capital letter. It takes in the new value. It might be number or the array of numbers if both of them like got updated, like upper value and lower value. And then we would take these new values and update our state. Okay, so we have that. Let's also add this in the filters container. So import range slider, and let's move it below our first filter. So yeah, let's save this, and here you can see the slider that we have. It was set to 37, and we can move this around and see the values at the top. So there's an issue with the background color. For some reason I set it to purple. Okay, it's showing up now. And now what we want to do is in the range, so let's create a drop down wrapper, because as you can see the slider was just directly displayed, so we want it to be displayed wrapped inside of a drop down. So just importing React, and then I'm creating a separate component for this one because we want it to be reusable. So let's declare props. In this case, I would use interface drop-down wrapper props. It's gonna take title for sure, and it would be of type string. So let's create the functional component itself. So it's a React functional component. It takes in the wrapper props that we just created. And let's destructure the props here. So this would be title, and returning the div element. Here we're gonna have a button that's going to open up our dropdown. It's gonna have the title. Let's import the button, but it's gonna display the title that's going to be passed by from the parent. So button from the material UI, and so after the button we would have to create the dropdown component itself. But for first, let's pass in the ID to the button, that it's a drop-down one. And next, let's do some aria label, and aria has pop-up true. Also, if it gets expanded, our attribute would be aria expanded. And then whether or not this value would depend if the drop-down is open or not. So I'm going to create this conditional statement, and we'll define open state later on. So variant, let's have it just like outlined. Disable elevation, also passing that as a props. And for end icon, we want that like the drop down itself, like the keyboard arrow down icon, I believe. Yeah, we can also import this icon from material UI. So let's go at the top, keyboard arrow down icon. Okay, so let's see, in here we also want to do some styling, passing on the border color. So I'm trying to make this look as much as the other filter possible, sorry, for the purposes of consistency. So adding some of the gray border, some color, this is for the text itself, and text transform we want none. Font weight also a little bit on the bolder side, and let's go here and instead import this drop down wrapper, and we are going to take the range slider and put it inside the drop down wrapper. So title, we need to pass the title. For now, I'm just gonna add dummy value dropdown demo. We'll update it. As you can see, it's here, but it's not, the range slider is not displayed inside of it. So because it needs to have element passed in itself that it's going to display as a children. So let's make that change in here. So first thing we would do is we would add like a styled container where we want our children to be displayed, using the styled function from material UI as well. So we'll be passing props. We can have menu props here, and then let's return menu. So this is where our children would be wrapped. Elevation, setting it to 0. Also anchor origin, because it needs to know where like which direction to set it. So let's set it vertical bottom. So where do we want the drop down to open? Also horizontal direction, let's set it on the right side because that's where we have the drop down arrow icon. And let's add some transform origin, would also be same thing, like vertical at the top and horizontal would be on the right. And this will take in like the rest of the props that has been passed by. Okay, so we're getting red lines in here. Oh, because I have an extra parenthesis. And this needs like a callback function, so this would take in the theme object of the current theme that we have defined. We haven't updated, so it will just use the default material UI theme. And if we want to target specific elements, this is how we do. So we say and then the name of the element itself. In this case, it was MUI paper root. So I had already inspected this element, so that's what I'm using here. Border radius 6. Margin at the top would be coming from the theme spacing itself, and so that would be 1. And then what else we have here? Minimum width, also let's set it to 180. Color would also be the same color as we used previously, so it would be like a lighter shade of gray. And let's also add some box shadow, just because the other filter also has it. So give it direction and also darker. So 0 pixels, it would only be in like one direction, so that would be okay. Let's actually do 1 pixel for this one. And paste the same thing at the end. One more time, because we have to define like all 4 directions for the box shadow, so that's why I'm like copying and pasting most of the things. Okay, moving off of box shadow, inside like this paper root, we have another like a list item itself, so that's what like the list menu itself, so that's what we want to target. So just adding some padding in here. And the next thing we want to update styling of is the menu item itself. So the name of the class name is like menu item dash root. So in here, let's open up brackets, and inside the item root, we're gonna have an SVG icon. And we'll just like update the font size of it. Let's set it to 18, and color would be also coming from the default theme palette. Text secondary. Right, also from theme spacing 1.5. Okay. So now another thing in here, that another state we want to target is active. So how does like background color change when it's active? And so what I'm like using here is similar things to just like match the previous element. So we want to take in the primary color from the palette, and also we want to use selected opacity, so that opacity gets updated. So let's have the styled menu in here. Below our button is where we want that to be displayed. And in here, let's wrap the menu items in the box. So this is for just demo purposes to test the container itself. So I don't think I have imported box in here, so I'll do that right now. Okay, so let's go ahead and save this. Yeah, let's add some ID in here, demo menu, and then menu list props. So area label by which we need for the accessibility. So this would be drop down menu. And we need to also like keep track of the anchor element. I'm gonna create a state for that one. So use state. This anchor, initially it would be set to null, but the type of this would be also like HTML element. So anchor element is, we need it for reference as to like where menu item should be placed. And so the open state would be boolean as to like it's gonna provide if it's open or not. So let's have handle click function in here that takes in the mouse event. So HTML element, basically when the button of the drop down would be clicked, that's when we want to change the state, and we want to set the anchor element itself, so using current target. So the button that was clicked would be passed as a target in here. So let's do the same for like handle close, when it means that we set anchor element to null, meaning we're not pointing our menu drop down to anything, so that would remain closed. So I think the import statement is wrong here, so menu, let's see, handle click. So passing in anchor element here, and then open would be also the state that we just created, and also the rest of the functions on close. So menu props, updating the import, and yeah, let's try setting it as any. I think it's complaining it's a TypeScript error, so let me just set to, yeah, okay. So let's go to like styles and create the filter styling. So filters module, first thing, let's update the container styling. So set this to display flex. Align items would be flex and then padding, let's add some padding at the bottom, so it'd be like 1/4 of the rem. And moving on back to the filters, let's import the styles from the module styles file. So this is just the Next.js way of defining styles, where we have to import it from the CSS file. This is for like also optimization purposes, so that the styles are not generic and the huge like CSS file does not get loaded on like every page, only the ones that you need. So as a class name, we pass the styles. It's kind of like an object with the filters container name that we just defined. So in here, we would pass on these filters that we just created, so 2 of them. And now let's moving back to the drop-down wrapper. Let's pass children as props, and children would be JSX element. So it could be just any element we pass it, and so it could be elements like as in like array of it, or a single element. So going back to our destructuring props, we set children also in here, and now going down, So let's say JSX as an issue. Okay, so that works. So let's remove this dummy text here and place children. So we need to pass the children on to the drop-down wrapper. So I'm going to close the tag here, move the range slider over inside the drop-down wrapper. Let's close it in, paste it in. Okay, and then now our red line should go away. Let's see. Okay, so right now this does not appear, the menu item, because we haven't passed the handle click yet. So on button click, let's say on click, and then pass the function that we have already defined. So let's go back here and update some styling. And so now let's create another component which would be another filter, autocomplete. So this would be basically like a list of checkboxes, and then we would show all the checkboxes that have been displayed as like checked. So let's import React first, and let's also import checkbox from material UI. And the next thing we would need is the text field, so the user can start typing, and based on what they type, the list of filters would get updated. Also, we will be making use of autocomplete also from material UI. And let's go create the component here. So export constant, let's name it autocomplete checkboxes. Adding the return statement and creating the autocomplete element. So for here, we can pass several things. First of all, let's make sure that multiple is enabled so we can have multiple values. For autocomplete, we also need to pass in ID, which is pretty basic. For the options, for now I'll pass in empty array because we don't have the list yet, but after that it will be coming from the parent element. Disable close on select, so we want to leave it open so they can select, users can select more than one options and see them. Option label, so we would pass in an option object that will have title, and that title would be what would be displayed as a text. As for the render option, so this would be like the selected options. So we would have props here, the option, and selected object itself. So that the ones that are selected, we would have list item for it. We're gonna pass the props, and then we have checkbox element in here. And here we want to determine, first we pass in the icon that I'll create at the top, and what happens when it is checked. Yes, so let's create both of these icons in here. So constant, let's say icon equals to, and then let's import the icon also from the material UI. So this would be outline and then empty for the non-checked ones, so blank icon. And then for here we can update some of the styling, but I'll do some basic, just the font size small. So import statement at the top, outline, blank icon. So our icons material folder from material UI, and let's copy the name and paste it in here. Okay, so for the next checked icon, name it also checked icon, and then this would be checked outline checkbox icon. We don't need the blank version in here, so same font size, just for the consistency, it would be small, and same thing, we import it at the top. Okay, so we have a mistypings in here, so let's fix them. So yeah, the B over there is not capitalized. So let's do some styling, add for the checkbox itself, so add the margin, 8 pixels. So for the checked, we want to determine if it's like part of the selected or not, so that's the value, boolean value that we would pass. And as a display label, we want to use option title. So that would be like the option that would be passed. And so overall style of the autocomplete container itself, let's set the width as the other filters have, which is 500. As for render input, would taking the parameters, so this would be where user would be like typing once they press the drop down, and they have this text field that will show up. So parameters label would be checkboxes. This would also, like, the label would be dynamic later on, and we'll update and pass it on from the parent. And just the placeholder, let's pass search this options for the text like input. So what do we have here? Yeah, so now let's define and like type props, create a new interface that we would name autocomplete props, and in here we do need the list of options that would be displayed. So options would be array of type option, and I'm gonna create a new type option, and as I mentioned, it's gonna have a title that would be of type string. So let's have that here. And turn this into React, like the functional component that takes in this type of props. So this would be autocomplete props, and yeah, we can do destructuring here, so options. Okay, so let's move back to the filters and import our newly created filter here. So autocomplete checkboxes from our components folder. And so this is the mock transactions data that I generated using the website that I'll link down below, and we want to create like a type for this transactions, because it would be reusable in like multiple places, and we also want to display the transactions in the data table. So let's see what kind of fields we have. So we have amount, category, and then transaction vendor. So let's going into the types file. This is where global types are defined. I'm going to create type transaction and pass it on all the fields that I just mentioned and went over. So first, also unique identifier, ID, which is type of number, transaction name that was of string. So this any type that I create in this file does not need import statements. It will be automatically imported. So files that finish in d.ts extension, those are the type files that are imported globally. So we have amount string, category string, transaction vendor is also string. So amount, ideally we want to have number, but for some reason the website that I use generated it in the string. So in the components, let's create our data table to display all this data. So first things first, import React. And then we also want all the table components I'm going to import from the material UI, and then they have several. So I'm going to copy this, paste it multiple times. Okay. And then update the names. So we would have table body, same thing in here. Table cell itself. And then we want to have the container that would be what would like parent of the rest of the elements. Header, so the column names would go here, as well as the row item. Okay. And then just paper to wrap this all up in, and this import is off. It should be material. Okay. So let's create the types for the props. So data table props, we know that we're gonna have columns, which is also going to be array of string. We're going to have data. So this is where the transaction type that we created previously comes in handy. So we can set a array and then pass transaction. So just to follow best conventions, let's capitalize the type itself. That's how I usually do. So update here, and as you can see, I didn't need to import transaction. It was automatically like recognized as a type. And okay, so let's go ahead, export our export and create our component. So this is functional component, passing in the types of props, and we can destructure this prop, so columns and data. And moving on to the return statement, let's start by creating the table. So first component would be that we'll be needing a table container. We can pass component as paper, so we can use paper to wrap the table inside. So table and then SX, like for some styling. We would set minimum width. We want the same to be as the other containers that we have, so that it looks better on the page. Area label is table as well. So for the table header, this is where the columns would go. So we would map out the columns. So let's have map. Column is of type string, so that's what I'm going to pass in here. And we would return the table cell for each of them. So table cell, key, which needs to be unique, but the names would be unique, so we can just pass it on as column. Alignment would be right, and then the name would also be the variable itself. We're following almost the same logic for our rows. Yeah, first we need to create one row for where we would store the column names. And then we would map the data, in our case it's the transactions, as part of like rest of the body. For each data element, like data object, we would have a new row. And then for each field of the object, we would have a new column cell. So data, map, and then row is of type transaction. So I think I have a misspelling here. So table row, let's create the row, and let's give it a key. That would be the name of the row. Some styling, which would be So targeting the last child. TD is like the element for table data. Table header. So at the end, we don't want to have any border, and so let's show the cell itself. So component is th. The scope of this cell is row because it's like part of the row. And then, well, first we want to, this is where we display the fields, right? So first we're gonna have transaction name. Then we're going to have our next cell. Let's set the alignment for this one. And I'm just gonna copy and paste it multiple times. So next, moving on to the next field, which is amount. We also had the category of the transaction, and finally we're gonna have the vendor name. Okay, so now that we have that, we can let's fix this first. The type. Yeah, I spelled it. Okay, so it should be good now. I think everything looks good here so far. Let's go back to the index and let's import our new table, and let's pass the data to it. So data table from our where did I save this? It was components. Yeah, technically I could have created, I guess, data table in the container and then the other rest of the parts of it in the components, but I guess this is simpler. And then let's import the data from the file. So this is mock transactions, the JSON file. So I think it's a default import, so we don't need, yeah, okay. So that was the name issue. And so let's get the column names first. So this would be first one, we had transaction name. Second one is amount. Then we have the category itself and then the vendor. So there will be the column names that will pass. And then we can add our table in here, pass columns prop to columns. I just did this capital letter because usually configs, that's what I capitalized the variable name. And as for the data, we're just gonna use the transactions without modifying it for now, that we imported from the JSON file. So let's go here. Let's reload this. So the data is not showing up, or because, okay, I'm missing the return statement in the map. I don't know why it happens a lot to me, that I forget that we need the return. But yeah, so let's make sure to add there. You can see the data coming in. We have all of our like fields here. Yes. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is fill up the filters for to display the proper data that's coming from our table. So for categories, let's say we want to display unique set of categories from the transaction categories that's in data, so that user can select from all the available categories that are there. So the reason I'm creating a new set is because I want the data to be unique. Otherwise, it would not be a good user experience if they see like the same category in the options twice, because that would not make sense. And the same thing for names. It would be just I'm gonna copy and paste it in here. So the names of the transactions. So amount range, I'm just gonna set it from 0 to 1000. So transaction name. So this would be all the data that would pass into the filters, and filters would display it as options that could be selected. And one more filter that we have is for the vendors. So let's also get that data from transaction vendor. And what we need now is that the filter components that we created, we just, in some of the places, as you recall, I manually added the data, for example, in here, like the constant names. So let's remove this and update the filters so that they take in this data coming from the parent. So let's use our create a new interface, type this props, and then afterwards, once we have that, let's pass the props from the parent component. So we want title to be string and dynamic, of course, and then list of the, in this multi-select, it would be an array of string as well. So let's turn this into a functional component. So constant multi-select cheap, this would be React FC, and we would pass in this interface that we just created, and we can do the structuring of the props here. Okay, so this would be title and the list. And let's update the dummy data here using our dynamic data and their variables. So first one would be title, second names. It's red because I just deleted it. We don't have it anymore, so let's use the list. Okay, so let's save this, move on to the filters, just because I changed the default import. That's why I have to put this in the curly braces. And then same thing for the filters. Filters would also be accepting all these 3 types of data for all of its 3 filters. So the container parent would be taking in all the data. So categories, once again, is array string, names also array string, and amount range is the only one that's different. That would be just a number. Two numbers, sorry, actually. And as you can see, we have the red lines for multi-select chip because we are not passing the data yet, but we'll be doing that now. So for title, this is categories, and for the list also categories. Okay, so let's save this, and in the index, so that's all the filters container is placed, right? So in here, we also need to pass in these 3 types of data that we just created as a props, so that we don't get an error. So, okay, so as you can see, these categories are filled from the column here, and could be selected. Now I'm going to make use of this divider, which is also some dummy component I had created for the components folder. I'm gonna use this to update, to put a place in between search input and the rest of the filters. So styles would be coming from home module, CSS, and so let's update it. This is just basically would be a one line that it's maybe size would be 1 pixel, and then it would be of color gray. So let's go back to the home module, and in here let's add divider class. So height would be maybe even not even 1 pixel, half a pixel. Background color would be this the shade of gray that I've been using for consistency, and then width would be maybe okay, so width would be the same width as a little bit less than the search input and the rest of the filters container itself, so it doesn't go full width. Margin bottom -10 pixels because we want it to be pushed up a little bit. Also in here for the search input, let's add like the title above the search itself. So I'll create this as a h1 element, and then styles would be coming from search header, and then let's the text pass it on as search transactions. And also update the styling of this in here. So color would be white because, as you remember, the background is purple. Setting some kind of margin top so it's not all the way at the top. Also we have a font size that's 36 pixels. So let's change the dummy data to Dropdown wrapper because now we have it as a price selector, so change it to price. And we also want to pass in the vendor names in here for our autocomplete. So adding that as a filters prop first. Once again, this is array string. And let's update the width of the box and add some padding at the top, as well as like the border at the bottom. Same thing, so we want rounded borders at the right and the left at the bottom, not at the top, because at the top it has like the search bar. So that's the reason why I'm doing this. So let's so before that we have not included autocomplete checkboxes yet because we didn't have any options to pass. Now that we do have vendor names, let's do that in here. And so in here I did create the option type, but we actually are passing only string, so we can just remove that for now. And yeah, okay. So actually I'm gonna remove this option label because it's pretty straightforward, doesn't need any updating. So let's update the width of this because we don't want it to be that big. Also set some kind of like a margin. And going back to the drop-down wrapper, just looking at the styling to make sure it's consistent with the rest of the filters. So adding a padding in here. As you remember, the sizing of the drop-down wrapper was like smaller than the other, so okay. And maybe let's remove this padding. Also update this to the same width as our like divider. So let's see. Okay, so this looks better now. All the filters have the same like height, but the only thing in drop down we can't see the values at the top because of the padding of the wrapper itself. So let's go there and add some padding. So let's say 30 pixels arbitrarily. And then, okay, so value on, so we do see the value of it. Okay, so that's good. Next thing. So as I mentioned in the repo, I had set up all the boilerplate code already for Redux, but let's go over them. So in action constants here, this is where, that's in like the definitions folder, this is where basically we would declare or all kinds of like methods for Redux. And in terms of methods, they're supposed to like take in the data and do like some kinds of updates. So so far I only created two, clear and update. So the way I would be using Redux state is I would create the state for all the selected filters, and then I would pass it on, like let's say if new data was selected, I'll pass it on the data and I'll update it. For the clear, as you remember, we created two buttons that say like clear. So this is where this function would come handy. Basically, it would take all the filters and it would return like empty objects. So it would set the state of the filters to an empty object. So there we have the constants. Let's say the reducer. So reducer basically serves as like a store, like defines store, where we pass in create like an initial state, and then we pass in all this type of actions, which action types we defined in the definitions action constants. So this will take in the action and this will update the state based on what kind of action is. So for example, if it is like the clear, it will on line 23rd, it will return the original state. If it's not clear, then we take in the data as a form of action.payload and set this data and set the state. So whatever it is in return statement, that data would be replaced and it would become the new state. Also in here, I had the reducer, the type that is taken in, I had created iFilter data, which I haven't defined yet. So let's do that. So here I have created initial state, all the categories, vendor, searcher text is empty. So let's go to the types now and create the type for our filters. So iFilter data, and then this would take categories, as I mentioned, which would be array of string. Also the vendors, same type, and search text, this would not be an array, this would just be a string. So let's see, in here we have these two options of clear state and update, and then by default it would just return state if it does not recognize the action type that has been passed. And yeah, at the top we are importing action constants, like the definitions that we already have. And so let's take a look at the actions. The actions itself define what happens once the type has been passed. So this is the methods that we directly use in our UI component. So in the case of like clear filters here, we just clear and return but no kind of data, we just perform the action. In terms of update filters, we pass in the category as in which kind of filter are we updating, and we pass in the new data. So this, as a payload, it would set that category like dynamic variable, and then filters as its value. Now the way we can use this is we can import these clear filters that I mentioned and update filters that could be used in our UI components itself, and that is what actions are supposed to do. So we import from our actions folder and actions file, and we also can import useSelector from React Redux and use dispatch from the package. So useSelector, what it does is it gives us ability to access the state, and useDispatch gives us ability to fire the actions. So let's create constant dispatch, useDispatch, and let's define the functions using those actions that we would later on pass into our like filters UI components. First one will have update categories. It will taking the new list. All of these functions will taking the new updated list of like selections, and it would use the dispatch and the function update filter action that we created, and as the value they would update, it would be categories, so that's the object value, filter object value, and as a list it would take in the new list. So same goes for price range. The only difference in here would be the array will be taking in is of the type number. And same thing, so I'll just copy this but update the names here. So the value would be price, and then this like the argument of the function itself. And so almost same logic following for the vendors. Yeah, let's update this two vendors and this as well. And this is just for the clear filters. We would create this and pass it on to the button clear that we already have defined. So this does not take in anything because it just returns like an empty filters object. So let's in here, I use the Redux DevTools. You can see the initial state, it's all set to empty. And so let's go ahead and inside the filter, different filters that we have, let's make sure that we pass these functions that we created. So filters would be the ones that once they get updated, our Redux state would also, using these methods, get updated. So this would be on handle change. The type of this would be, it would take in an array of number as an argument, but the return statement of this kind of like methods is always void, because it performs an action, it does not like return new value or anything. So and then let's make sure we call this function here. So we do have handle change already, so but the thing is that we don't want this to let's say if user is sliding, we don't want the Redux state to get updated because it will reload and reload the component. So we want it only to update when user is done sliding. So that's when I'm gonna use the handle on drag stop, and this would call the Redux state update function. And in the slider, it's on change committed prop, and pass it on the function that we just created. Okay, so let's save that. Moving on to the next filter, which is multi-select. Same thing here, we need to pass in the method, so let's name it on handle change. Also, this one takes in the array of strings, because that would be the new selected values. Once again, we have void in here, and editing the destructuring. So I just declared the type for this. Okay. So, and instead of having the use, so I'm just gonna update the way we call use state in here. So import use state and use effect from the top. So the reason we want to use effect in here is because every time the selected values get updated, we also want to fire the Redux action. So I'm gonna make use of on handle change here and pass in the newly updated value. And then in the array here, we pass in our dependency, which is filter name. Okay, so let's moving on to our third filter, autocomplete checkboxes. We need to once again take in the function. Also, let's make it label dynamic, so it would be passed as a string, and on handle change. So updated list array of the string, and returning void. Passing label and also the on handle change in the destructuring. And we also need to, I guess, like keep track of what has been selected. So we'll create a state, name it selected values, and use state as a string array. Initial value would be an empty array, and then what we'll do is we'll create this handle on check update. So once checkbox is checked, we'll take in the event and we'll also take in the value. And based on that, what kind of like, if it's true, if it's false, if it's been checked, unchecked, we would update the state, and afterwards we would call this function with our like new value. So here, since I haven't imported useState, I need to use react.useState. And so what is the issue here? Okay, so we haven't passed in the onChange yet. So let's pass it on the onChange, so it will take in event and the value. And it would call this like method that we just created. So we haven't defined types in here, that's why it's throwing an error. So this is new value is string, and then event is of like just type event. Okay, so this one needs to take in string array. So let's just change it to any for now until we figure out how we can handle the string versus string array. So because we updated the props of this elements, we also need to update the way we call these elements from the parent container. So passing on all these functions that we just created. Handle change, and this would be update vendors. And we also created a label for this one, so let's pass in vendors. Okay. So as you can see in the state in here in Redux, once we select something, it gets updated. So those functions are working. Oh, let's fix the no options part. So here we are passing vendor names. Let's see if we have vendor names. Let's see in the index if we're passing. Oh, okay. So we're not passing to the filters itself. So okay, so we have vendors at online 21, so I'm just gonna pass that for as a vendor names. So let's reload this. Okay, maybe there's an issue with the name itself, or oh, so in here props, I never passed the props coming from the parent, so that's why we were getting like a empty array. So let's pass in our options prop, and I think this should be good. Also, let's pass in the value itself would be the option as like a string that it's getting. So to make sure when we fire this handle on check update, the value gets passed to it. Okay, so we can see all our vendors here. So this is it for part one. So what we did in part one is we created the search box. We also created filters. We passed in the filters and also the data table. And what we did is once we update the filter, we stored the selected filter state in the Redux. So that's how it gets, once like user updates the filter itself, the Redux state gets updated. For part two, I guess this is sufficient to just get familiar with how like TypeScript, React, and Redux work together and how to create a state that's shared by many components. As a part two, I'm planning to do itself like filtering of the data that we see in the table, which we haven't done in this section. So make sure to subscribe and let me know if you like this video and if you want to see more of like Redux content. So, thank you.